Dare to enter Crow's Quill's books, where tales of forgotten realms and fearless souls come alive. Today's journey, Plato Wyngard and the Valley of the Immortals, chapters 13 and 14, by Mark and James Lindsay. Will you uncover the truth hidden in the shadows? Chapter 13. A few hours after the feast, everyone had turned in for the night. With the help of Not, everyone scheduled for sentry duty had been liberally dosed with a slow-acting sedative that would be kicking in right about now. Plato, Luther, and Nat were packed light, only the essentials: climbing gear, lights, and weaponry. Plato checked his watch. We have 7 hours till sunup. By my estimation, we have about 30 minutes of walking to the entrance of the chamber. So 5 hours to seek the answers that we're looking for, and 1 hour to allow for a fudge factor. Are we good to go? Plato asked. Yeah, Luther replied, but he was looking a little bit sluggish. Plato wasn't sure if that was the mountain of food he had devoured earlier or second thoughts. Either way, he said he was good, and Plato knew better than to question his word. Are we going to just talk, or are we going to get going? Not said, with the typical impatience of youth. Plato gave him a deadpan look in return. No cigarettes? Plato replied, and the 3 men picked up without a word and slowly and stealthily slipped out of the village. Nat had been true to his word, and all sentries were snoozing soundly. Despite the near dark created by the dense canopy overhead, they made good time to the resting place of Tan Vien. The entrance to the chamber was an easily identified cave on the side of the mountain. Using machetes, they hacked their way past the thick vegetation and crawled into the mouth of the cave. The entrance was pretty tight, a little over 1 meter in diameter. Luther insisted on going first, his familiarity with tunnels a specialty in his previous line of work. The tight confines of the mouth lasted about 20 meters in length, then opened into a small room-size cavern. The 3 men were happy to have a little more space to move. Plato cracked open a lantern and let the light flood the area around them. The room was unremarkable except for 4 tunnels leading out on the opposite side. Each tunnel had an image above it. Plato held up the lantern to get a better view. The first tunnel held the image of a wild pig, the second a horse, the third a fish, and the last a woman. The 3 men studied each one very carefully. I take it that only one of these is the correct way in, Luther grumbled. Yeah, but which one? Plato wondered. As you have already told me over and over since I joined your little team of entrepreneurs, I'm on a need-to-know basis. Well, gentlemen, I need to know. Plato gave the young man the summarized version of events and exactly what they were doing in their current location. Not took the news as he did with everything else, casually and with a barely held appearance of interest. Oh, is that all? The Wraith, the Viper, an unknown European connection, and the 4 Immortals. You 2 don't muck around, Not said with a smirk. Plato was going to say something, but the young man waved him down with a cockily. I'm not really too interested in the other things, but the 4 Immortals, now that actually makes some sense, Not said, as he pulled a cigarette from his pocket, then put it away with a sigh when he saw Plato's impatient expression. I think I can help. Do you know much about the 4 Immortals? Not asked. Both men shrugged. Only a little, Plato replied. Luther nodded in agreement. How long have you been living in my country, and yet you know so little of my culture? Not asked. Hey, that's not fair. I think in our time here we have picked up plenty, Luther shot back. Whatever, Not said. Without giving you a comprehensive lesson on the subject, each one of those symbols represents the 4. Which is which? Plato asked. Liao Han is represented by the mother, Not said, pointing to the fourth image. Chu Dong-tu loved to fish. He pointed to the third. Saint Gyong fought foreign invaders on an iron horse, pointing to the second. And of course, Tan Vian protects the mountain people, teaching them to farm and hunt, hence the pig. Not said, matter-of-factly. So as this is the resting place of Tan Vian, I would have to say that the first tunnel is our way in, Plato said. Well, we hope anyway, Luther replied. Walking over to the side of the room, Luther grabbed a sizable boulder from the floor and moved towards the last tunnel. You want to give me some light? Plato moved towards the fourth tunnel and held out his lantern so they could see down its length. With a grunt of exertion, Luther rolled the boulder down the passage. They held their collective breath as they watched it move, the downward slope aiding its movement. Maybe we were wrong, Plato said. Then without warning, the floor beneath the boulder gave out, and it fell into the darkness below. After a few seconds, they heard a loud crash as the boulder hit terra firma far below. Stay here, Plato instructed. Wait, don't be an idiot, Luther growled, but Plato had already entered the fourth tunnel. Crawling carefully, he made sure to check the floor beneath him with each meter gained. He stopped near the giant chasm before him and peered down. What can you see? Luther asked, his eyes wide. It took Plato a few seconds to focus his vision, and what he saw filled him with dread. Ever so slowly, he backed out of the tunnel. What did you see? Not asked again. There's a drop of about 20 meters, Plato said. That doesn't sound so bad, Luther said, and the floor is covered in spikes. I'm guessing about 30 centimeters in length, but I can't be 100% sure, Plato said. Wonderful, Luther said. Do you want to turn around and go back to the village? Plato asked. No, of course not. Not how sure are you about the symbols above the tunnels? Luther asked. 85%, Nat replied, his confidence looking a little shaky. Hey, 85's not bad. I've bet on poorer odds, Luther said, trying to make a joke. Would you bet your life? Plato asked, and there was silence. Well, nothing ventured, nothing gained, Plato said, determined, and walked straight over to the first tunnel. You don't have to be the one. Luther's voice trailed off as his longtime partner disappeared from view. Nat and Luther stood at the opening of the tunnel and watched Plato's progress. The dull light of the lantern getting dimmer and dimmer until all they could perceive was darkness and the sound of Plato's shuffling echoing back. Then there was a brief silence. I'm all right, Plato called back, and both men breathed a sigh of relief. I'll go last, Nat offered, just in case your dead weight is too much for it to take. Luther growled and pushed the surprised younger man into the tunnel, and then followed suit. It only took them about a minute to pass through, Plato assisting them out. The three men looked around and were pleased to see a larger chamber than before. This time, a raging underground river flowed in front of them, and on the far side the entrance to another tunnel. 3 narrow rope bridges covered the river's expanse. The river moved with a ferocious speed, disappearing down into the dark recesses of the mountain. In front of each bridge was a stone totem and more images carved upon their surfaces. The first, the symbol of a mask, happy in its visage. The second, a fishing pole, and the third, a garden hoe. Luther grinned broadly. I think that I've got this one. It's obviously the fishing pole. Water, easy, Luther said confidently as he prepared to cross the appropriately marked bridge. Hold up, Plato said, just as Luther prepared his footing. "Don't worry, I got this. I promise that my large bulk won't break it," Luther said, giving Nat a dark look. "Wouldn't count on it," Nat said with a disinterested shrug. "It's too easy," Plato said, unsure. "What's wrong with easy? I like easy," Luther said. "Explains a lot," Nat muttered. "What was that?" Luther growled. Plato sighed. "Gentlemen, concentrate. From the little that I've gleaned, Tan Vien was kind of like the patron saint of many things. Hunting, which could explain the fishing pole, or farming, the garden hoe. Festivals, the happy mask. I don't think so," Plato said, deep in thought. "Well, which one?" "Time's a-wasting," Luther said impatiently. "While part of me wants to agree with you, the fishing pole feels like a misdirection. If I were to choose one, it would be the garden hoe," Plato said. "Explain," Nat said with the first real sign of interest. "Remember when we first arrived in the village? What was one of the first things that we saw?" Plato asked. "Fields, children, women cooking," Luther replied. "Yes, all of those things. But what really stood out was the waterfall. The villages had rigged up irrigation to it. To these people, water means life. I think that this river probably supplies the villages with its water," Plato said. "That's a big stretch," Luther said. "No, he's right. It rings of truth. That hoe represents farming, and this water is instrumental to its growth," Nat said. "Fine then, it's the hoe," Luther said, a little annoyed at being bested by the other two. Without waiting, he strode over to the bridge marked with the hoe, steadied himself, and then proceeded to cross. "Luther, it's just a theory," Plato said, watching helplessly as his friend risked his life. They watched as Luther slowly crossed. The creaking of the braided rope stretched and groaned under Luther's weight, and much to their relief, he made it across without incident. "Hey, you were right," Luther waved back happily, then rolled his eyes at the knowledge that he had nearly made the wrong choice. Plato and Nat were quick to follow in his footsteps. With all three now across, they stood with tired resignation as they stared at the tunnel ahead. "Well, we're not getting paid by the hour," Plato joked, and they entered into the darkness. The tunnel led them through a series of twists and turns, then finally released them into a third large antechamber. On the far side was a stone table with a depression in its center. Plato guessed it to be the resting place of Tan Vien. He now wondered, with the Tan now absent, what he hoped to learn in this underground lair. Behind the table was a large, empty wall covered only in thick moss. The only thing stopping their advance was a deep, dark chasm which Plato couldn't see the bottom of. Two thick, sturdy ropes hung suspended from the ceiling and were tied to pegs driven into the ground on their side of the chasm. In front of each peg was a large stone step, on one the crude image of the sea, wavy lines representing the water, and a sun mounted on the horizon. On the other step, nothing. "What does this mean?" Plato asked Nat, who shrugged in reply. "It's obvious that only one rope is going to accommodate us. But which one?" The three men stood in silence, trying to fathom the ancient riddle that was being asked. "So far we've been asked who it was that rested within the mountain," Plato said aloud. "Then what was most important to the people of the mountain?" Nat added. "So what would be the final thing asked?" More silence as they chewed over this information. "The way that I see it," Luther said slowly, "we have one final obstacle to reach our prize, with only a black darkness opposing us," he added. "Did Tan Vien have an enemy?" Plato asked Nat. "He did. Well, sort of, anyway. Tuitin was his opposite," Nat said. "His opposite. Tuitin was the god of the sea, often responsible for destroying crops and killing animals when waters rose. Nat said with a grin. So if that's the case, do we take the rope with the image of the sea or the one with the blank image? Plato asked them. A long pause. Luther moved towards the rope with the blank step. Unhooking it from the peg, he checked its worth by tugging hard upon its tautness. How do you know that it's the one? Why are you so sure? Nat asked, confused. He's right, my friend. The step is blank. It's too vague to risk, especially since Tan Vien is missing anyway, Plato reasoned. Luther smiled back. There's a reason why it's blank. We're the missing piece, Luther said. I don't understand, Plato said. It's about faith, Luther said, and took a running leap. With rope in hand, he flew across the gorge and landed safely on the other side. Plato let out a held breath at seeing his friend safe and unharmed. With their way now mapped, the other two men joined him quickly towards the final destination. Chapter 14, Plato stood before the dais that supported the stone table and looked for booby traps. He was fairly certain that there were none, but one couldn't be too careful at this stage of the game. Adopting a position on his belly, he carefully looked at the floor, and a smile crept on his face. We're good, Plato announced and climbed to his feet. You sure? Luther replied uneasily. Positive. I can see footprints and some of the moss has been disturbed. The wraith and her people are good, but not good enough, Plato said. Then he carefully mounted the dais, joined by Luther and Nat. This table would be worth a small fortune on its own, if you could only get it out, Luther muttered. The big man was right. The table was huge. The top was 1 meter square and 1.5 meters high. Plato estimated its weight close to 1 ton due to the heavy slabs of stone used in its construction. But what had really elicited the comment about its worth was the detailed carved images that covered every inch of its surface. Every fabled battle and mythical entity from Vietnamese mythology could be seen in all their majestic glory. I wish I'd thought to bring a camera, Plato mused. They all studied the table in the hope that there was something they could glean from the images. I hate to say it, but when the wraith took Tan, she probably took anything else that could have been used to help with the other immortals, Luther said. Nat had moved off to the side and fished a cigarette from his pocket, and was in the process of lighting it. Bloody hell, how many times do I have to tell you? How about you cut me some slack after everything that we've been through? Besides, it helps me think, Nat said. Okay. If it'll shut you up for 2 seconds, just do your thinking quietly, grown-ups are talking, Plato said condescendingly. Jerks, Nat said, and lit his cigarette and watched the two Westerners discuss their next course of action. He let his mind wander as he stared at the far wall and the moss that grew upon it. Nat sighed. The contours of the moss kind of looked like the rolling mountains and valleys of his countryside. In fact, the more he studied the moss, the more he was certain that was exactly what it looked like. It couldn't be, he thought as he dropped his cigarette and walked slowly towards the far wall. Plato and Luther were too involved in their discussion to notice the younger man. Nat was now only 1 meter away from the wall, and he couldn't be any more positive about his theory. Placing his thumb and forefinger in his mouth, he let loose with a short, sharp, piercing whistle. Plato and Luther spun around, annoyed at the sudden interruption by the now smug, smiling Nat. What's the problem? Plato asked, gritting his teeth. You two might want to check out this wall? Nat suggested. And why's that? Luther asked. Because it's a map, Nat replied. It had taken them the better part of an hour, But they had managed to clear the moss from the wall, and sure enough, there was a detailed map of the Vietnam region. Sprawling mountain ranges, rivers, and a long coastline. Having flown from end to end on numerous occasions, both pilots were well versed in the Vietnamese landscape. But this map was different in many aspects to the Vietnam they were familiar with. This map must be hundreds of years old, Luther surmised. Probably older, Plato interjected. Obviously, the regions and smaller rivers may have changed, but those mountains and coastal areas are still the same. Those other main points on the map are obviously the other locations of the Immortals. But what the heck is that? Luther said, and pointed to a large green gem that sat in the southern area. Nat studied it, then shook his head. I have no idea. It's in a small valley. That's about all I can tell by the map, and I've never been too familiar with that region, Nat said. It's an odd shape, almost like an arrow pointed to the north of the valley, Luther said. Do you really think they would have set it so obviously? Plato said. Well, the map was hidden from view initially, so maybe they have to point some things out, Nat said. Plato wasn't convinced. It's in the Kon Tum province, but the valley itself doesn't seem that familiar, Plato said. I'll mark it on the map the monk gave us. What about the writing on the side of the map? What does it say, Nat? Luther asked. I honestly don't know. It's something that predates our current writings, Nat said. I'll write it down. Maybe we can get someone to decipher it later, Plato said, as he carefully attempted to transcribe the unfamiliar symbols accurately onto paper. After 10 minutes, they all agreed that there was nothing more they could learn here. Let's saddle out, Plato announced, and prepared to leave. I have an idea, Luther said, and moved towards the green gem on the map. Producing a long, thin dagger from his boot, he was about to attempt to pry the gem from the wall. Wait! Plato yelled. Everyone turned to him. I don't think that it's such a good idea to do that. I've heard that the Department of Antiquities is coming down on foreigners who desecrate or steal treasures from their country. Well, we're not stealing. We're borrowing. Besides, with the map exposed, nothing could stop the Wraith or anyone else for that matter, if they decide to come back, Luther said, now waiting for Plato's answer. Sure. I mean, our intentions are righteous. What could go wrong? Plato said. Luther smiled and shrugged and proceeded to use his dagger to lever the gem from its housing. A short time later, the gem popped into his waiting hand. Then all hell broke loose. The moment the gem came out, the cave began to shake violently. Dust and small rocks started to fall from the ceiling. Put it back! Plato yelled at Luther, indicating the gem in his hand. Luther nodded and tried to pop the green stone back into its housing, but it refused to stay in place. The shaking was getting worse by the second. Forget it! We need to get out! Right now! Plato yelled, struggling to be heard over the moving rock. The vibrations and shaking were now so bad that the three men were struggling to stay on their feet. Plato pushed the other two men towards the rope. Hurry up! Get across! I'll follow. Luther was about to argue, but Plato thrust the rope into the big man's hands. No time to argue! Go! Plato yelled. Luther nodded and swung across, landing on his butt. He quickly tossed it back. Nat was the next to go. His landing was more cat-like in that he landed on his feet. As he prepared to toss the rope back, a violent tremor rumbled through the room, and the rope slipped from the young man's hands and drifted uselessly to the center of the chasm. They all stared in hopeless disbelief as they were now separated with Plato stranded on the other side of the gaping hole below. I'm so sorry, Nat screamed at Plato. a look of abject concern on his face. "It's not your fault. Shit happens," Plato yelled back. "Brother, you can do this," Luther yelled back calmly. Plato couldn't understand his meaning. Large rocks as big as footballs were now starting to fall. All three of them looked up as they tried to dodge the beginning of the ceiling's collapse. "You have to get out of here," Plato yelled back. "Not without you," Luther shot back, and Nat nodded, although his usual cocky exterior was now replaced with certain fear. "You can do this," Luther said again. But Plato couldn't understand his meaning. Then he followed his friend's gaze towards the rope that hung uselessly in the center of the chasm. "You can't be serious," Plato said, shaking his head at the insane suggestion. "What choice have you got? If you do nothing, we all die here. If you jump and miss the rope, you die and we'll leave," Luther said. "You'd leave?" Plato said. Luther smiled. "But if you reach the rope, well, you know the rest," Luther said. Plato let out a loud gust of breath, then nodded. "You're right. Besides, I'm not too sure that the ceiling has got much more time before it collapses and we're squashed like bugs." Plato grinned. He backed himself up towards the map and tried to judge the distance to the rope. About 3 meters, Plato thought. Not an impossible feat. Plato took several deep breaths as he worked up his courage. Luther and Nat were watching on, physically unable to breathe. Plato tried to relax his body and focused hard on the rope, blocking out everything else: his friends, the shaking, falling rocks, and most importantly, the black abyss to his front. Plato nodded to Luther, who nodded back. Then, with every ounce of strength in his body, he sprinted to the edge of the ravine. Keeping his gaze focused directly on the rope, he ran, as if his life depended on his efforts. Keeping his breathing regulated and his muscles firing, he judged his steps and leapt at the very last possible second, his toes kissing the edge of the chasm. Plato's body seemed to hang frozen in the air. With his arms outstretched and fingers wide, he hit the rope at top speed, and as his hands wrapped around the thick rope, he clung on for dear life. Plato's momentum continued to thrust him forward, as both him and the rope swung out in a wide arc, propelling him across the ravine and into the waiting hands of Luther and Nat. Plato's friends gripped onto every part of him as he landed at the chasm's edge and then pulled him to safety. Laughter erupted from the three of them as they helped Plato's shaky form to his feet. "Good to have you back, brother," Luther said, clapping him on the back. "Let's not ever do that again," Plato said. "I'm so sorry," Nat said, his eyes downcast. "Save the sorry. Thanks for staying," Plato said, and ruffled the younger man's hair. "Let's stow this reunion and get the hell out of here." They all nodded and raced out of the chamber and into the smaller tunnel. They were barely in when they heard a crashing sound from behind and turned to see the ceiling collapse. "That was way too close," Luther said in awe. "And it's not over. We have to keep moving," Plato said as they continued on down the tunnel and back into the second antechamber. The tremors were now building to a crescendo. Rocks were raining down, and the atmosphere was thick with dust and dirt. They looked at the river and were glad to see the bridges were still intact. "We have no time to waste. We all need to cross at once." There was no argument as they raced towards the braided rope bridge and proceeded to cross in a single file. Looking back later, Plato wasn't sure if it was because of the tremors, the age of the rope, or the weight of the three of them, more than likely all of the above. But without any warning, the ropes snapped, and the three adventurers fell into the raging river and were swept away into the darkness. that seals today's tale in shadows. We hope Plato Wyngard and the Valley of the Immortals has drawn you deeper into its enigma. Return soon to Crow's Quill's books, where the next chapter awaits, whispering secrets yet untold.